Hello everyone, welcome to the programme. Today we are looking at Western Sahara, the crucial bargaining chip used by President Donald Trump in what must surely be one of his final big foreign policy deals. It is a diplomatic decision that puts his successor, President-elect Joe Biden, in a rather invidious diplomatic position. In a phone call last week, the US president confirmed with Morocco's king that Morocco would restore formal relations with Israel for the first time in 20 years. Now that's a big deal because most Arab nations do not have formal relations with Israel, partly because of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. Egypt and Jordan were the only exceptions until this year, when President Trump and his son-in-law Jared Kushner persuaded the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and now Morocco to do the same. The agreements are collectively known as the Abraham Accords.
I wanted it to be called the Donald J. Trump Accord, but I didn't think the press would understand that, so I didn't do that.
Right after the phone call with Morocco's king, President Trump tweeted, "Another historic breakthrough today. Our two great friends, Israel and the Kingdom of Morocco, have agreed to full diplomatic relations. A massive breakthrough for peace in the Middle East." The Palestinians were less convinced and very frustrated.
إننا وباسم شعبنا الفلسطيني إذ ندين بكل عبارات الشجب والإدانة هذا الإعلان التطبيعي الجديد الذي يتعارض مع حقيقة وأصالة دولة المغرب وشعبها المدافع عن القضية الفلسطينية على مر التاريخ.
But Israel's Prime Minister, by contrast, was delighted.
Peace has never, the light of peace on this Hanukkah day has never shone brighter than today in the Middle East. President Trump, the people of Israel and the state of Israel will be forever indebted to you.
As a result of the deal, Israel certainly looks less isolated in its neighborhood. It now has formal relations with 6 Arab nations, and Israelis will soon be able to take direct flights to Morocco. Trump's also a beneficiary, being lauded by some as a peacemaker, perhaps even worthy of the Nobel Peace Prize. And King Mohammed, well, he extracted a very special concession. President Trump agreed to recognize Western Sahara as belonging to Morocco. This is a pretty outrageous move for many of the indigenous people who live there, the Saharawi, who have been fighting for independence for years.
It has definitely ignited a new spark in the Sahrawi resistance and struggle to fight for our legitimate and inalienable right to self-determination.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. And we have in Rabat, Mohammed Ahmed Gain, who is a professor and academic in the capital there. Neri Zilber is an Israeli journalist based in Tel Aviv. Neda Hashemi, a Middle East expert at the University of Denver. And Sidi Omar represents the Saharawi people at the United Nations and will be joining us in the second half of the show. And Neda, I'd like to start with you. President Trump, in a typical sort of hyperbole, describes this agreement as a massive breakthrough for peace in the Middle East. I know you're skeptical. You consider it more PR than a breakthrough.
That's correct. I mean, one just has to look at who the key actors are in these series of agreements between Israel and the Arab states to see why there's room for deep skepticism. I mean, you have Donald Trump, widely viewed as a racist American president, and his corrupt son-in-law engaging in a secret deal with a neo-fascist Israeli prime minister and several Arab dictators. To add to that, you have the figure of the notorious Saudi crown prince, who's widely viewed as a consultant, advisor, and co-architect of these diplomatic deals. So on that measure alone, there's room for deep skepticism with respect to these deals that are being struck between this, motley crew of unsavory characters.
Mohammed Ahmed Gain, I'll have to give you an opportunity to respond to that. Your king, apparently, according to our academic here, is dealing with a nefarious bunch and basically brought out a nefarious deal.
Well, let me tell you that that's not the first time I hear such really flawed interpretations and understanding of what is going on. Morocco's resumption of relationships with Israel are just, as I said, Morocco is resuming its relationships by opening again a liaison office, which was there since the mid-90s up to 2002. And Morocco's relationships with the Jewish community of Moroccan origin, which amounts up to 1 million. This relationship is unique and makes the position of Morocco regarding the Middle East, the developments as being very, very special. This resumption of relationships aims first to serve this Jewish community who visit every year. Almost 70,000 of these Jews of Moroccan origin visit Morocco every year. So should we really suspend or really violate their right to regain their origins every year by continuing such a supporting such a stalemate or being part of this deadlock in
sure,
the Middle
but
East?
Mohammed Ahmed, I think we'll allow Nader to make a response to that, because I know you're concerned, Nader, not so much about the ability for Moroccan Jews to go back to Morocco. You're more concerned about what this does as a decision over and above the heads of the Palestinians. What is the concern there?
Well, it's not just over and above the head of the Palestinians, it's over and above the head of the people of Morocco, who have had no say on this question. And according to the Arab Public Opinion Survey just published, 88% of the people of Morocco oppose normalization of relations with Israel. So this is effectively being rammed down their throat. I'm all in favor of Muslim-Jewish relations expanding, but it has to be based on a fundamental position of equity. If Moroccan Jews are allowed to go back to Morocco, why can't Palestinians go back to their homeland? What does the King of Morocco have to say on that question?
Nader, before we get on to that, the survey that you quote from was from October, and the Moroccan people at the time would not have known that the recognition by President Donald Trump of Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara was even on the table. Would you not agree to that?
Well, that's correct, but that just underscores my point. Let the people of Morocco have a public, open, and free debate on this issue. Let there be a national referendum, and let them decide whether this deal is in their national interests or not. The fact that the King of Morocco and his allies do not allow a public vote, a public debate, public input on this question suggests that their position is not very popular in Morocco, and they have a lot to fear from public input on this decision.
Let's go back to Rabat. Mohammed Ahmed, what do you think? Do you think the king took a high-handed decision, or should have consulted via referendum the Moroccan people?
It's really astonishing and strange to me to hear about referendums. Foreign policy choices that are grounded based on historic connections. The relationship between Morocco and Israel cannot be at the expense of the Palestinian cause. And this was straightforwardly declared and emphasized by King Mohammed VI in his phone call with Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen. King Mohammed VI has stated that Morocco's position remains unchanging. And the Palestinian cause is in the same rank as our national territorial integrity, which is a priority concern for us regarding our relationships at the international level.
Let's bring in, if I may, let's bring in the Moroccan king's statement, in which he is trying to reassure the Palestinians. He says measures do not in any manner affect Morocco's ongoing and sustained commitment to the just Palestinian cause. Well, we put that to the test, and we spoke to one Palestinian journalist, Mouin Rabbani, who told us the following. Have a listen.
Well, it's quite clear that the Trump administration is seeking to use its final weeks in office to transform the dynamics of the question of Palestine, whereby Arab states normalize relations with Israel completely independently of any considerations about Palestine in order to obtain goods and services that they're seeking primarily from the United States and to a lesser extent from Israel. So this is a particularly interesting deal whereby basically the United States recognizes Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco's normalization of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory.
Mohammed Ahmed, clearly quite a lot of skepticism, to say the least, in the Palestinian territories.
Let me tell you that Morocco is part of the Arab League, and the Arab League has an initiative that is the King Abdullah initiative that is based on the two-state solution. This two-state solution implies a recognition of the Israeli state. If we remain, cross-handed without taking advanced steps towards bringing the parties to the table for, to negotiate sustained solutions. This will not bring peace to the region. Morocco belongs to, a doctrine now at the international level that believes in realism. There is an Israeli state. How could we really ensure that the Palestinian state is, the right to a Palestinian state is protected through peaceful negotiations without, of course, compromising the very important principles. Among these is to preserve the Islamic character of Jerusalem, which was emphasized by King Mohammed VI, without also changing the status of Jerusalem. So these are the founding principles of Morocco's position regarding this issue.
Let's quickly pop over to Tel Aviv now, and we have Neri standing by. Neri, I'd like to get the Israeli perspective. Your Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, rather like Donald Trump, is portraying the so-called Abraham Accords with Arab countries as bringing peace to the Middle East. Here's what he said: the light of peace has never shone brighter on the Middle East. I'd like to ask, we've heard the Palestinian reaction, the Moroccan reaction. What do Israelis make of these Abraham Accords?
Well, the sentiment in Israel is overwhelmingly positive. We have to remember that it's not just Morocco most recently, but it's as well the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, who have also entered into these normalization agreements in the broader rubric of the Abraham Accords. Israel wants both recognition and acceptance in the Middle East and North Africa, and they're getting it primarily via U.S. Concessions and, shall we say, goodies to these various states. So whether it's recognition of Western Sahara for Morocco, or F-35 stealth fighters for the UAE, or delisting from the terror list for Sudan, these are all concessions made by the U.S. With nothing really asked in return for Israel. So it's a pretty good deal from Jerusalem's perspective.
Yeah, Neri, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is facing a corruption trial and possibly an election next year. Are these accords going to help the Prime Minister in the face of either of these challenges?
Undoubtedly. We're already seeing a fourth election in 2 years is looming as early as this coming March. We're already seeing messaging from the Prime Minister and his Likud party that not only are we about to vanquish the coronavirus through vaccinations that are starting next week, but he messages repeatedly and directly that I brought peace to Israel, UAE, as I mentioned, and Morocco most recently. It's a very major domestic issue here in Israel.
Okay, now we have looked at how the big players have played this geopolitical game, the leaders of Israel, the United States, Morocco. But what about the people who live in Western Sahara? Western Sahara lies south of Morocco, which controls roughly 80% of the disputed territory, including almost the entire Atlantic coastline. Just 20% is controlled by the Saharawi group known as the Polisario Front. Then there is this tiny sliver of land close to Mauritania, which is a buffer zone patrolled by UN peacekeepers. The two areas are split by a barrier 2,700 kilometers long, built by the Moroccans in the 1980s. The Polisario Front has been fighting for Western Sahara's independence since 1973, confronting first the Spanish colonizers, then, for the past 45 years, Morocco. There's been a ceasefire in place for the past 30 years, until it was broken just last month in a dispute over Morocco's access to Mauritania. The United States, under Donald Trump, now recognizes Morocco's sovereignty over Western Sahara, but the United Nations still regards it as a non-self-governing territory, which leaves President-elect Joe Biden in a foreign policy dilemma when he enters the White House on January the 20th. Okay, let's bring in our next guest, Sidi Omar now. He represents the Saharawi people at the United Nations. Sidi, thank you so much for joining us here on The Nexus. For our viewers who don't know much about your people, about your struggle, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much for having me. Very briefly, Western Sahara is a former Spanish colony that was occupied by Morocco in 1975 after Spain pulled out. And ever since, that led to a war of liberation under the leadership of the Frente Polisario, that is internationally recognized as the representative of the Saharawi people, fighting against the Moroccan occupying forces until 1991, when the United Nations managed to bring the two parties together and conclude a peace agreement based on a ceasefire and a referendum on self-determination, in which the Sahrawi people will decide to be independent or integrated in Morocco. So the deal was agreed by both parties, but when the United Nations started implementing the deal and coming up with a list of voters in 2000, Morocco reneged on its commitment, obviously for fear of the outcome of the vote. And ever since, Morocco has been blocking this referendum and occupying a large part of the territory. And as of 13th of November this year, it broke the ceasefire by attacking a group of civilians who were protesting against the illegal Moroccan occupation of part of their land, leading to the rupture of these almost 30 years of a ceasefire, and then leading to the resumption of armed conflict, which continues to date.
Can you describe what makes Western Sahara and the people of Western Sahara distinct from Morocco, in your opinion?
Well, the Western Saharans are distinct from the Moroccans, from all their neighbors, by their distinct cultural distinctiveness, which was affirmed by the International Court of Justice in 1975, ruling that Western Sahara used to be ruled by groups, social groups, who have their own political and social organization.
Mohammed Ahmed, if I can come to you, there are a number of points that were made just then. If you could briefly put your version of events.
Let me tell you that we are talking about a regional dispute that has nothing to do with, these claims for, separation, led by the Polisario. The Polisario is an entity that is serving certain geopolitical agendas, cloaked and under these international law principles. And there is no really clear, claim, and there is no single text from international law that states that the right to self-determination goes necessarily through a referendum. We should also know that the right to territorial integrity has the primacy over the right to self-determination. Morocco has gained its independence gradually since 1956 up to 1975. Now we are talking about 85% of the Sahrawi population, to whom I belong. I am also Sahrawi, and we adhere to the development and peace, and we have made our choice since the beginning. We are against any unrealistic and disruptive choices that will take us to violence. Unfortunately, we are in front of an entity that really sponsors the, instability in the region. I defy, your guest here, Sidi Omar.
Just quickly, if I can. I'm sorry to just interrupt because we're running out of time. I got to get to the agreement, but just quickly, Sidi Omar, I give you a chance to respond, and then I want to put to you what the White House has said about autonomy.
Yeah, well, I can just say very simply to your listeners and viewers to look for the United Nations resolutions on Western Sahara. You will see that Western Sahara is an issue of decolonization, that Morocco does not have a sovereignty according to the International Court of Justice ruling of 1975, and that according to the United Nations General Assembly, Morocco is an occupying power of Western Sahara in line with Resolution 34/37 of 21st of November 1979 and 35/19 of 11 November 1980. These are United Nations resolutions that you can check out there, and they describe Morocco's presence in Western Sahara as an act of occupation.
The chances of our viewers looking up the United Nations documents is quite slim, but they are aware of what the White House is saying, and they're saying it is not a realistic option for resolving the conflict, and that genuine autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty is the only feasible solution. They're talking about an independent Sahrawi state not being a realistic option. It does appear, after Trump has made this decision, that events are going against your mission.
Well, let's very briefly say that what outgoing US President Donald Trump said is nothing new. This position has already been expressed by US government. But the main issue here is that President Trump doesn't have sovereignty over Western Sahara, and Morocco does not have that sovereignty, as the United Nations has made it very clear. So this is a very simple, short-lived propagandist exercise that indeed has given visibility to the question of Western Sahara, and then has given to the Moroccan regime a more time to foster its questionable popularity and to its domestic public opinion. But there will come a day very soon when the Moroccans will realize that they have given up on their principled position regarding the Palestinian question in exchange of a short-lived illusion, because Morocco doesn't have any sovereignty over Western Sahara to be recognized, and President Trump will be out of the White House in a few days' time.
Well, that brings me to my next and possibly final question, which is about what's going to happen with your efforts at the United Nations and also with the United States. Let's start with the United States. You still have some allies. You have Republican Senator Jim Inhofe, the chairman of the US Senate Armed Services Committee, who denounced Trump's decision, calling it shocking and deeply disappointing. He says the people living in Western Sahara should vote in a referendum to decide their future. Mohammed Ahmed, why will a referendum not be helpful here?
Very simply, and I'm really sorry to hear such really unrealistic and inaccurate interpretations of states' positions. The referendum is impossible to implement simply because the Polisario refuses to carry out a census in the camps. Up to now, we don't know who is in those camps, and these are questions asked by even the international community. The Security Council has continuously demanded a census to be carried out to know who is in the camps. Besides that, and if we look at all the resolutions made by the Security Council, they are calling all the parties, including Algeria, to come to the table of negotiations to negotiate a pragmatic, lasting political solution, but it's also based on compromise and realism, which is something very, very important. The United States recognition of the Moroccan sovereignty over the Sahara is a very flagship event that marks the modern history of relationships between Morocco and the United States, but also reinforces the position of Morocco as always been adhered to. Realism is the way out of this deadlocked situation.
But of course, governments change, don't they? And this is what Sidi was alluding to. Sidi, a final question then for you. You say that Joe Biden is coming in. How are you intending to prevail upon his administration and the United Nations to overturn what Trump has done?
Indeed, and let me just say that the United Nations is a great nation. Its policy is not dictated by an outgoing president. So we hope that the new administration will return to the United States its position as a neutral player in this conflict and be faithful to the founding principles and value of the United Nations itself, which is the principle of self-determination. This is what we hope from the incoming administration, to set the record straight and to continue playing its positive role in pushing forward for this peace process to enable our people to exercise freely and democratically their inalienable right to self-determination and independence, thus putting an end to the last colonial case in Africa and ending these standing Moroccan occupation of a non-self-governing territory, which has been on the list of the United Nations since 1963.
Sidi Omar, Mohammed Ahmed Gain, thank you so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, you can see this episode or our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus, TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.